which is where I'd like to say a moment about something about this whole question of genetics and illness, and genetics and human behavior in general. You know, there's been a modern trend to find a gene for anything. You know, some comic wrote about 30 years ago, they're finding a gene for everything. A gene for line dancing, a gene for liking British food, you know, a gene for everything. But the reality is when you actually examine, and President Obama, not President Obama, President Clinton, when he announced the Genome Project, he promised the world that through these genes, we're going to find the language of life. And we're going to find out exactly why people get diabetes, why they get Alzheimer's, why they get everything, and we'll be able to prevent and treat these conditions. That was back around 2000 or 1999, something like that, I think. Well, we found out since then that we haven't found anything of the sort. The Genome Project has yielded virtually zero in terms of the prevention of human illness. And why is that? Because genes don't determine a whole lot in terms of human behavior or human health. There are some diseases that are specifically genetic. One runs in my family, it's muscular dystrophy. If you inherit the gene, like my mother and my aunt did, then you're going to have the disease. But those diseases that are genetically determined are extremely rare. And most conditions that beset human beings are either, most of them are not at all genetically determined, and even those that have some genetic predisposition, that predisposition still depends on the environment to trigger them or not to. So you can take something like breast cancer in women, and there's some breast cancer genes. If you inherit the gene, your risk of getting that disease is much higher than the average. But out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 carry the gene. 93 do not. Out of 100 women with the gene, not all of them will get the disease. No, they're a much higher risk, no question about it. It just means that, for the most part, genes don't determine illnesses. What then does? And by the way, this is true for whether we're talking about most physical illnesses and mental illnesses. So to talk about genetics is kind of a lazy person's way of trying to explain something, because scientifically, there's very little basis to it. So for example, all these genetically determined mental health conditions, they say about ADHD, which is something I've written about after my own diagnosis in my 50s, that it's the most heritable mental illness there is. Well, as I say in this book, to say that ADHD is the most heritable mental illness is like saying that quartz is the most chewable crystal, because it's not true. It's neither a disease nor is it genetic. Nobody has ever found a single gene that determines any mental health condition. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that determine any mental health condition. Nobody has ever found a group of genes that if you don't have them, you will not have a certain mental health conditions. There are a large group of genes that the more of them you have, the more you risk, and more at risk you are for any number of mental health conditions, but no specific ones. Which means that the genes cannot cause the disease, because if they did, when they showed up, so should the disease in every case, but it doesn't. And you can have the same disease, or if you want to call it that, but even without the genes. Because the fact is, scientifically speaking, that genes are turned on and off by the environment. So it's a question of what kind of environment is acting on certain genes that'll promote one kind of development or a less healthy kind of development. And that again comes back to the social context. Because it's in the social context, in our set of relationships with our parents, beginning in utero, where the emotional stresses on the mother will already have an impact on the developing brain of the child and the physiology of the child. The birth process, the birthing process, the child-rearing environment, these are the conditions under which we develop in healthy ways or we don't. And my argument is that in this culture, it's increasingly a toxic environment that distorts human development. So if you want to understand why more and more kids are being diagnosed with everything under the sun, and being medicated for it, for that matter, or if you want to understand why there's a rising, inexplicable rising tide of childhood suicides in the United States, about which there's a lot of hand-wringing, but very little insight. Well, if you want to understand the New York Times article that 6 weeks ago revealed that there's one teenager who's on 10 different psychiatric medications. 10 different, they should maybe be on one, if at all. 10 different psychiatric medications. Well, what accounts for the rising tide of addictions, of autoimmune disease? Either you assume that these are all genetic conditions, which, by the way, even on the face of it cannot be true, because genes don't change in a population over 10, 15, 20, 30, or 100 years. So if something is rising, whatever's doing it, it cannot be genetic. If the rate of multiple sclerosis, the gender ratio, which in the 1930s used to be close to 1-to-1 between males and females, is now more than almost 3.5 women to every man, whatever's causing it, it can't be genes. There's nothing that determines that it should be that way. So we can make 3 assumptions. Either these are genetic conditions, which they're not, or we can assume that these are random, inexplicable events, misfortunes that somehow strike people for no reason whatsoever that we can discern, which is basically the medical understanding, because we call these conditions idiopathic, like autoimmune conditions and so on. Idiopathic means we don't know what causes it. Or we can say, well, maybe there's something in the environment that is triggering the onset of all these conditions of ill health that show up in mind and body. And if, since the numbers of these conditions is rising and the number of people being affected by it is rising, then just as in a laboratory, if you're growing organism in a lab culture and many of them got ill, you'd have to say, this is a toxic culture. There's something about this culture that's making the creatures that live in it sick. I'm making the same argument about the culture that we're living in today. I mentioned multiple sclerosis. In 1870 or so, or 1860 perhaps, the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who first described the condition, said in so many words, well, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, that this is a stress-driven condition. He said this 150 years ago. Sir William Osler, the Canadian physician, knighted by Queen Victoria, I think he taught at Oxford. He also was one of the founding physicians at Johns Hopkins in the United States. He said that rheumatoid arthritis was a stress-driven condition. In 1870, the New York Times, about 6 months ago, had an article. They've done some study that showed that women with breast cancer, the more depressed they were, the worse their prognosis was. In other words, there was a relationship between the emotional state of the woman and the outcome of her illness. And the New York Times thought this was amazing news, except for the fact, when you look at the medical literature, in 1870, for God's sakes, there was a British surgeon called James Paget who said the same thing. Now, the difference is that from the time that Jean-Martin Charcot made his observations and William Osler made his, and James Paget observed what he observed, at that time there was no research to back it up. There was no research either to show the correlationship between stress and trauma and adult illness, or illness in general, nor was there research, nor was there the scientific knowledge to explain the physiological pathways between stress, emotional difficulties, and physiological illness. We didn't have the science. No, we do. We've had multiple studies now to show the relationship between stress and trauma and multiple sclerosis. We've had multiple studies showing the same relationship between these same conditions and rheumatoid arthritis, or, for example, malignancy. A study came out of Harvard 3 years ago, I think, that showed that women with severe post-traumatic stress disorder have doubled the risk of ovarian cancer. Now, if that was the only study ever done, it should have sent every physician running to figure out what's going on here. What's the relationship between an individual's emotional states and their trauma and their physical health? But you know what? The study barely registered on the medical radar. And you'll never go to a gynecologist and be asked, what happened to you? Endometriosis, a condition of women that has to do with uterine tissue showing up in parts of the abdomen where it doesn't belong. It's a painful condition, it's associated with infertility, and it's also elevates the risk for cancer. Studies have shown that women who are sexually abused in childhood have a higher risk for endometriosis. But you go to a gynecologist, nobody's going to ask you about childhood trauma. So, on the one hand, we have this gathering and accumulating medical evidence, scientific evidence. On the other hand, we have a medical system that completely, I can't even say it ignores it, because you know, to ignore something, I have to be aware of it. I mean, I can't ignore you unless I know you're there. They're not even aware of it. Most physicians are not. This is not a knock against individual physicians. I'm talking about a system here. Because this system separates the mind from the body. Not just the medical system. The whole ideological system of this culture separates the mind from the body. The medical system simply buys into the ruling ideology from that perspective.